The Neue Wache, or the New Guardhouse, has sat here on Berlin's Royal Boulevard, the Unter Linden, for over 200 years. And in that time, without moving an inch, it has stood in 6 different countries. In Prussia, in the German Empire, in the Weimar Republic, Nazi Germany, East Germany, and now in reunified Germany. And in that time, of course, it has been a guardhouse. It's been a place with over-the-top changing of the guard ceremonies, but actually, for much of the last 100 years, it's been a memorial. And you can imagine with all those different regimes, it has changed a lot. So let's talk all about it. The Neue Wache was finished after 2 years of construction in 1818, and its architect was none other than Karl Friedrich Schinkel, one of the most important architects to ever leave their mark on Berlin. And despite World War II, despite all of the damage that caused, you can still see many of his works around the old royal core of Berlin today. There's the Altes Museum on Museum Island in this kind of brilliant, symmetrical, neoclassical style. And similar to that, over on the nearby Gendarmenmarkt is the Concerthaus. And at the end of the Unter den Linden is the Brandenburg Gate, which was not designed by him, but a small part of it was. If you look up at the statue, inside of the wreath held in the staff, there's the Iron Cross, a symbol of the bourgeois resistance to Napoleon designed by none other than Schinkel. And then turning around from the Brandenburg Gate, one would walk down the Unter den Linden, the Royal Boulevard, which is lined with these very ornate, whimsical lampposts designed by Schinkel as well. Eventually on that walk, you would come to the State Opera House, and in fact, many of the sets inside of that, which were incredibly elaborate, were also designed by Schinkel. And very close to that opera house is the subject of our video, the Neue Wache, or the New Guardhouse, the first of Schinkel's big commissions. And the person who commissioned it was none other than the King of Prussia himself, Friedrich Wilhelm III, who, quite atypically for Prussian kings, was probably not the most present person in the minds of his subjects. That was rather his wife, Queen Louisa, who was a fair bit younger than him and was seen as being very beautiful, but also intelligent and vocal and quite fun. But the couple had quite a big problem. Quite a typical problem for monarchs in the early 19th century, actually. Napoleon Bonaparte, who of course invaded Berlin in 1806, marching through the Brandenburg Gate, stealing the statue, heading down the Unter den Linden to the present-day Museum Island, the Lustgarten, where he drilled his armies. The Neue Wache sits between those two, and in its original instance was actually something of a memorial for the victims of the wars with Napoleon, but we'll get onto that in a second. Now, Prussia wouldn't be totally defeated until about a year after the first invasion of Berlin, 1807. Prussia's borders were back then very, very different to Germany today, and the easternmost parts were Königsberg, present-day Kaliningrad, which is, of course, now part of the Russian Federation. And it's up there at a place called Tilsit, where in 1807 Queen Louisa sat with Napoleon and demanded better conditions for Prussia under his occupation. Now ultimately she failed, but the very act of standing up to him was seen as a unifying, as a galvanizing moment for the people of Prussia, especially when, to be frank, her husband was probably not the most popular. He was seen as very quiet and reserved and essentially bowing down to his new master, whereas his wife wouldn't stand for it. Sadly, she would not live to see Prussia free again. She died in 1810 from respiratory illnesses, and she was only aged 34. Napoleon would be defeated a few years later. You have the Wars of Liberation, as they're called, here in Germany, but his ultimate defeat would of course come in Waterloo in 1815 at the hands mostly of Britain and Prussia. After his defeat, Johann Gottfried Schadow's Quadriga, the statue atop the Brandenburg Gate, was brought back from Paris, put back in place, and it was changed. She then got the Iron Cross, which, as I said, had become this symbol of resistance against Napoleon. It was the case that wealthy people would sell their gold for iron. Basically, they would buy a small iron cross and effectively donate their wealth to the state to help fight off Napoleon. A couple of years after this, the Neue Wache was completed, and whilst it does mostly look the same, there used to be statues that surrounded it. They are still out there today, but not in their original location. Either side of the Neue Wache, you had two generals, Bülow and Scharnhorst, and then across the road were Blücher, York, and Gneisenau, all also designed by Johann Gottfried Schadow. Oh, hey, small correction. The statues that used to stand either side, that are now not on the other side of the road like I thought that they were not made by the sculptor Johann Gottfried Schadow. They were made by Christian Daniel Rauch. I know you were thinking it. Schadow also left his mark on the Neue Wache himself. There's a row just above the columns of little mini Victorias representing victory. And then there's a frieze above that, which was actually designed by a different sculptor, August Kiss, and that was added in the 1840s. And that shows Victoria in the middle, awarding victory to one side and resigning the other to loss. The Neue Wache would serve its original purpose as a guardhouse for 100 years, from 1818 to 1918. And there used to be multiple rooms inside, guards were stationed there, and those guards were actually assigned to the King of Prussia himself. And a couple of those kings did rather enjoy the Neue Wache, the uniforms, the changing of the guard, everything that came with it, really. The first of those was Wilhelm I, who became king after the death of his brother in 1861, and then would become Kaiser or German Emperor 10 years later in 1871, when, after the wars of German unification, Prussia and its allies had defeated Denmark, Austria, and France. They then met, the allies there, in the Palace of Versailles and put together the idea of a unified Germany where the Prussian king would become the German Emperor or Kaiser. It's actually said that Wilhelm I would watch the changing of the guard at the Neue Wache from his window across the road in the Crown Prince's palace. It was his grandson, though, Wilhelm II, who would be in power during the Neue Wache's, I guess, most funny, there's not a lot of funny history to do with this place, but its most funny incident, which came in 1906. Now, to set the scene a little bit, we have to understand that Prussia was a heavily militarized society. The military was incredibly well respected and was really kind of omnipresent in the society. For example, young Prussian boys at the age of 10 would be very excited to get their hands on their Prussian military uniforms. To illustrate the ridiculousness of this cult of uniform, there is a fantastic story from 1806 about a man named Wilhelm Voigt, or otherwise known as the Hauptmann von Köpenick, the captain of Köpenick. Now, Voigt was something of a petty criminal. He'd been in and out of prison a lot, and I guess in 1906 he was looking for a way to make a little bit of cash, and he came up with a brilliant idea. Such is the power of the military that if I looked like a military man, I'd be able to get away with anything. And so he goes to a bunch of second-hand stores and he picks up all of the different parts he needs for a Prussian captain's uniform. He then finds a group of soldiers and tells them that he needs assistance, that the mayor of Köpenick and his treasurer have been embezzling funds. Köpenick is now part of Berlin, but back then it was a separate city. Anyway, he grabs his soldiers, he hops on the train, he goes to Köpenick, he walks into the town hall, and he has the two men arrested. Such is the power of a Prussian uniform. Well, not only are they arrested, they're taken back into town, sequestered in the Neue Wache, and whilst the Prussians are working out, who is this guy, what's going on, the captain of Köpenick, Wilhelm Voigt, makes off with 4,000 marks. As I'm sure you can imagine, a manhunt ensues once they realized what's happened. And in the 10 days or so it takes to find him, he's become a real local legend. The public really admired him. They thought, good for you, you've got one over on the authorities. It's kind of funny. He was captured, he was arrested, he spent only 2 years in prison before being pardoned by the Kaiser himself, Wilhelm II. And once he was free, well, how's he going to make money now? As an entertainer. He told his story, he traveled across Europe, he traveled, I think, across the world, telling his story, and people would come to his shows, and he was, really something of a celebrity at the time. Just after the captain of Köpenick made off with his money, the German state started plowing ever higher amounts of money into the military. On the 1st of August 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm II stood at one of the balconies of the city palace just next to the Neue Wache, and he addressed a crowd of thousands of people. He told them that Germany is now at war with Russia, and the crowd cheered. And 4 and a bit and millions of deaths later, Germany was defeated in the war and facing revolution. As the revolutionaries came to Berlin, Wilhelm II fled first to Belgium, and then he was ousted, forced to abdicate, fled to the Netherlands. The revolutionaries would then occupy the palace and the Neue Wache, but ultimately those buildings were not going to be used by the politicians of the new, shaky democratic republic. And so without a royal family to guard, there's no need for a royal guardhouse. And so this is when the purpose of the Neue Wache changes to being expressly a memorial. In 1931, the whole place was redesigned by an architect named Heinrich Tessenow. Actually, he was a teacher at the Charlottenburg Technical University. One of his students was Albert Speer. Tessenow created this empty, austere space. There was a granite block in the center with a gold and silver wreath above it. And above that, he opened up a hole in the ceiling, an oculus, to allow the snow, the rain, and the sunshine into the memorial as well. Now, this was very much a memorial of the conservative military establishment. That conservative military establishment who had really taken a beating to their reputation as a result of the First World War. No longer was the military, the Prussian military, seen as the peak of German society. And it's that wing of society who would certainly dabble in nationalism, fascism, who thought that because they were such great warriors and soldiers, they hadn't really lost the war, that they had been tricked and cheated by the Social Democrats and later the Communists, who had been the leaders of the revolution, who had signed the Treaty of Versailles and sold Germany's future and its military prestige down the river, but ultimately they would blame Jews. Now, when the Nazis came to power, they looked at this memorial and they thought, this is great. This is a place of honor for soldiers. This is what we like. This is what we stand for. It's worth noting that this isn't how all memorials in Germany were. Up in Hamburg, next to the town hall, there was a great big memorial for the 40,000 sons of the city who had died. The Nazis did not like that because they saw it as a place of shame, of hating Germany, of hating war. And so not only did they keep the Neue Wache, but they changed it to essentially meet the needs of their anti-Semitic politics. The only thing that they added was a cross on the back wall, a Christian cross. Now, the Nazis had a bit of a funny relationship with Christianity. The idea of the light and savior of the world being Jewish didn't necessarily appeal to them, but racists can always twist whatever they need with any kind of twisted logic to make anything appear as they want it to. So for the Nazis, every great and important figure in history, going back to the Egyptian pharaohs, they were all Aryan. And so Jesus was Aryan and not Jewish. And even though that makes the whole Christian story make no sense, just ignore it. The real reason, at least in my opinion, of putting a Christian cross in the back of this memorial was to essentially exclude Jews and diminish the role of Jews in the First World War. Jews had been very proud that the First World War was the first war where they were able to fight. The sad truth as well is that the Iron Cross, which had become the highest medal awarded in the German military, Hitler was given one and he was recommended for the medal by a Jewish lieutenant by the name of Hugo Gutmann. Under the Nazis, the Neue Wache, as a place that really did represent the military establishment, became yet another place where they would organize marches and parades. You would have soldiers and SS outside of there until, of course, you didn't. The Neue Wache, like many buildings in the area, suffered heavily in World War II. The entire roof was collapsed, and by the time the war ended and the city was occupied, it lay in the communist eastern side of the city. And in communist East Berlin, the Neue Wache would continue to be used as a memorial as well. It was fixed up by the 1960s, by which time it was known as the Memorial to the Victims of Militarism and Fascism. And of course, as this had previously represented the conservative military establishment that they really hated, they made sweeping changes to the place. I mean, the structure was still the same, the oculus was still there, but they placed the large East German emblem there with the hammer and compass. They also placed the name of the memorial across the back wall. And then in the middle, they had this large glass block, which I think looks quite cool, quite 1960s, and that featured an eternal flame. However, in 1969, they added another part to the memorial, which was very controversial. It's still there and still is controversial. They added the remains of two people. One, an unknown German soldier, a Wehrmacht World War II soldier, and the other, an unknown concentration camp victim. Now, of course, many people said that there's no way that these two people should ever be sat next to each other. So what was the thinking? Well, I suppose for East Germany, they were communists. They were saying that they were not responsible for what the Nazis had done, that they were in fact victims of the Nazis. That was the general view of history. And more to the point, the Nazis and fascists had survived, and they had survived in the West, and the West are the bad guys and we are the good guys. And while there are elements of that, former Nazis making their way into the West German government, far more predominantly than in the East, it's still a very convenient and simplistic view of history. The other thing really is, I guess, what people call like the clean Wehrmacht theory, the idea that the soldiers were just following orders and that it was, the Nazis and the SS who were doing all of the bad things. And I mean, it's just not true. The Wehrmacht, there's lots of evidence of this. They were very much complicit in the crimes of the Nazis. So for the anti-fascist state to do this, I think was at best very, very clumsy. It's also worth noting that the Neue Wache became something of a tourist attraction in East Berlin. Once again, people would come to see the changing of the guard, the guards there in their East German uniforms. Curiously, when they did the changing of the guard ceremony, they also chose to do the goose step, which internationally is very much associated with the Nazis. It's worth noting that the Nazis didn't invent that the Prussians had done it before, but for a country that had made a memorial for the victims of militarism to then station armed soldiers goose-stepping outside the front seems, quite hypocritical, utterly bizarre. It's no surprise then that when the Berlin Wall came down and that when Germany reunified and it was decided to make Berlin the capital again, that the Neue Wache would have to change. And the new, and I should say present version, was opened by the former West German, now reunified German Chancellor Helmut Kohl in 1993. And that version was also controversial. The idea that we had these problematic memorials there before and that then it was going to be this new national place of mourning. Does that tie the new reunified state to the Nazi state, to the communist state? Maybe. It depends on your opinion. And you're welcome to have your own. I've been taking tours to this place for many, many years, and my opinion on it has actually changed in that time. But I think ultimately what they decided to do, despite any controversies, is ultimately a rather good thing. And so what you would have seen in 1993 and what you'd see today as well is a statue on the inside designed by or made by a sculptor called Käthe Kollwitz. Actually, it's not her original. Her original is something like 30 centimeters or 12 inches tall. This version is much larger, and it's a copy that, has some controversy because it was made, without her consent several years after her death. But the image is so powerful. It's one of my favorite things to show people in the city because it is a mother holding her dying son. Now, let's talk about Käthe Kollwitz. Her and her husband in 1914 were quite pro-war. Germany's going to go to war, it's going to be great. Their son, Peter, he wanted to go to war as well, and so they thought, you know what, this will be good for the lad. He's 17, off he goes with his friends to war, and very early on, October of 1914, aged only 17 or 18 or so, he was dead. And as parents, of course, this was really a crushing sadness, but because he'd talked about it and they'd allowed it, they also felt really even more responsible for their son's death. Now, Kollwitz was a sketch artist as well as a sculptor, and her works after this would, quite unsurprisingly, be very sad. She would be seen as, somebody who wanted to highlight the horrors of war, and that meant that in Nazi Germany, she was deemed a degenerate artist. Works of hers were removed from galleries and museums, and she herself was, it was really the end of her career once she was deemed this degenerate artist, the thing that the state absolutely hated. Very sadly, she died relatively old, in her mid-70s, but she died only 16 days before the Nazi defeat, before they signed the surrender on the 8th of May 1945. A friend of mine does like to point out that where she died was just next to a wonderful, beautiful palace, a place called Moritzburg, so perhaps one of the final things she did was have this wonderful, beautiful view, knowing that this war was coming to an end, but still. It's very sad that she never actually saw the end of that and the rehabilitation of her career and her character. I also like to reflect on the fact that, you go into this memorial today, there's a small bit of text. It's the memorial to the victims of war and tyranny. On the outside, at the entrance, there's quite long text that says it's for these victims, and these victims, and these victims, and these victims. What I like is that Germany's Central War Memorial is not a place where we remember and honor heroes. It is a place of sadness. It is a mother grieving for her dying son. That is what war is. Okay, that's my piece on the Neue Wache. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you especially to all of my patrons. I will see you in the next one.